There are places in this country where the ground has never been tested, not because it's clean, but because no one was ever required to ask. These are places where children lived, where children were buried, and then quietly, where children stopped being anyone's legal problem. And that's where the explanation stops. In 2013, construction workers in Mariana, Florida broke ground on a plot of land that had been sold, resold, and rezoned over several decades. They weren't looking for anything unusual. They were building. Then the radar readings came back strange. Beneath the surface, in irregular patterns, were more than 50 anomalies. Not geological formations, not tree roots. What came up from that ground were the remains of children, some as young as 6. The land had been part of the Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys, a state-run institution that had operated for over a century. It closed in 2011. The property had been transferred, developed, sold in pieces. No one had checked what was in the ground. That would be strange on its own, but that's not the only case. Across the United States, between the 1850s and the mid-20th century, there were thousands of state-run institutions for children, orphanages, reform schools, training schools, asylums for juveniles. They operated under different names depending on the state, the decade, and what the administrators preferred to call them. Most of them kept records. Some of those records survive. Many do not. What's consistent, across institution after institution, state after state, is a pattern that becomes difficult to ignore once you begin looking for it. Children entered the facilities and sometimes never left. The institutions closed. The land was sold. And in most cases, no federal law required anyone to ask what happened on that ground before the sale was finalized. Records show that at Dozier alone, more than 100 boys died during the school's operation. The official death toll listed on institutional records, 31. That gap has never been fully explained. Now here's something worth pausing on. The sale of institutional land in America was, and largely remains, a matter of state and local jurisdiction. When a state closes a facility, the land typically transfers to a state real estate office. From there, it's evaluated for market value, rezoned if needed, and sold. The process is, by most accounts, efficient. What it is not, in most states, is required to include any investigation of what that land was used for. There is no federal mandate, none as of recent records, requiring states to conduct forensic or archaeological surveys of former youth institutional grounds before the land is transferred or sold. I cannot fully verify that no state has ever voluntarily done this, but I can tell you that the cases where remains have been found, Dozier in Florida, the Sunland Training Center in Gainesville, the former boys' home grounds in Alabama, they were not found because someone looked before the sale. They were found because someone was building something. And this is where it gets difficult to ignore. Let's go back further, because the land itself is only part of the story. In the 1850s, a movement called the Orphan Trains began in New York City. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 200,000 children, many of them not orphans at all, but children of poor immigrant families, were placed on trains westward. They were distributed to farming families across the Midwest and South. The record-keeping was inconsistent at best. Some children were adopted. Some were indentured in all but name. Some simply disappeared from the paper trail entirely, recorded as placed with no follow-up documentation, no confirmation of well-being, no subsequent records of any kind. The Children's Aid Society, which ran the program, maintained archives, but the children themselves had no legal advocates. No oversight body tracked what happened to each placement. Of the roughly 200,000 children placed, historians have been able to trace outcomes for a fraction. The rest are simply absent from the record, and that's where things stop making sense. Because here's the question the absence raises. When a child disappears from a paper trail, when a placement is listed without outcome, when a death record doesn't exist, when a grave is unmarked, what does that mean for the land? The institutions that received these children also own property. Some of that property had cemeteries. Some of those cemeteries were documented. Some were not. The Dozier site had a known cemetery. It was documented. What wasn't documented, what the construction radar revealed, was that the known cemetery and the actual number of graves were not the same thing. There were graves outside the official cemetery boundary. The suggestion isn't that this was always intentional. There may be reasonable explanations: unmarked graves from disease outbreaks, record-keeping failures, the general disorganization that comes with understaffed institutions managing too many children. But that doesn't explain why the land was sold without checking. And here's where the pattern connects to something larger. When the post-World War II era brought about the gradual closure of large institutional facilities, partly due to reform movements, partly due to shifting federal funding structures, the land those institutions sat on became extraordinarily valuable. Urban land, rural land, acreage near expanding suburbs. In many cases, the closures happened quickly. Institutions that had operated for 80 or 100 years were shuttered within months. Files were transferred, sometimes incompletely. Cemeteries were sometimes marked, sometimes transferred to county jurisdiction, sometimes simply noted in a property deed as area of historical interment, with no further action required. In at least several documented cases, property deeds transferred land that referenced burial grounds, without any requirement on the buyer to preserve, survey, or disclose that designation. The land was valuable. The children buried in it were not, by that point, anyone's legal responsibility. This is not an allegation of conspiracy. It is a description of a system that was designed to move efficiently. And efficiency, in this case, meant that certain questions were never asked. You walked past buildings that used to be something else. We all have. A parking structure that was once a hospital. An apartment complex on land that used to be a state school. A park built over ground that was sold, cleared, and repurposed without a full accounting of what it held. The Dozier site is now being preserved, in part, because researchers from the University of South Florida pressed for access before further development could occur. That effort began in 2012. The first confirmed remains were identified in 2013. By that point, portions of the surrounding property had already been sold. The university team found what they found in the area they were allowed to access. What's beneath the rest of it? The parcels already transferred, already built upon, remains unknown, because no one was required to look. There's a legal concept called chain of title. It refers to the documented sequence of ownership for a piece of land, who held it, when, and under what conditions. Chain of title does not, in most American jurisdictions, require disclosure of what happened on the land. It records ownership, not history, not use, not what was left behind. When a former orphanage is sold, the chain of title shows the institution, the state, the real estate transferor, the developer, the buyer. It does not show the children. They are not part of the legal chain. They were never property. They were wards. And when the institution closed and the land was sold, there was no legal mechanism that kept them attached to the record. They simply fell out of it. And this is the part that requires some silence. Because the Dozier case was not quiet. Journalists covered it. Researchers documented it. Florida's governor at the time acknowledged it. But Dozier was found because someone built something on it, and the instruments picked something up. There is no national survey of former institutional grounds. There is no federal registry of unmarked grave sites on former state property. There are, by one researcher's estimate, hundreds of former juvenile institutions across the country whose grounds have never been forensically examined. That number may be conservative. Some of those properties have been developed. Some are in the process of being developed. Some are sitting in state land inventories right now, valued by the acre, waiting for a buyer. And in most of those states, the law does not require anyone to look before the sale goes through. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to overstate this. The historical record does not suggest that children were systematically buried in secret on a massive coordinated scale. That's not what the evidence points to. What the evidence points to is something quieter and perhaps more unsettling. It points to a system that treated certain children as administrative problems, that kept inconsistent records, that closed without full accounting, that sold land through processes designed for efficiency. And it points to the fact that no one, at the level of federal law, ever required the question to be asked. Not in the 1970s, when most large institutions closed. Not in the 1990s, when a new wave of property sales occurred. Not now. The question of what's in the ground at these sites remains, in most cases, legally optional. In 2021, a bill was introduced in Florida to fund continued archaeological investigation at the Dozier site and similar former state facilities. It did not pass. The University of South Florida team's funding ran out. Their access to the site became limited. The work continued on a reduced scale. As of the most recent records available, not all anomalies at the Dozier site have been excavated. There are areas that flagged on ground-penetrating radar that have not been opened. They remain underneath. And here is the question that this leaves. Not the question of what happened at Dozier. We know something of that, though not all of it. Not even the question of why the land was sold the way it was. The legal and bureaucratic answer to that is fairly clear. The question is quieter than that. It's the question of what we decided at some point was worth asking, and what we decided to leave unanswered. There are places in this country right now, addresses, parcels, lots, where the ground has never been tested, not because it's clean, because no one has ever been required to ask.